Yeah, there's a couple things that I often see. One, why do you exist? What pain point are you solving? Probably two, and they're a little bit generic, but they're meaningful. One, and I think it's been a consistent theme throughout this, actually both of them have, is don't be afraid to take a step back and think about things. Pause. Um, Someone gave me that advice a long time ago, which is basically just take a step back and breathe. Whatever you think is absolutely critical to jump into right at this moment in time, reflect on it. And again, the conversation we had previously, which is we're so myopically driven towards an outcome and it's just go get it done. It's take a step back. Does this make sense? Is this going to achieve what I'm seeking to achieve? Is there a better way?
Welcome to GrowthPulse, the B2B sales podcast. You might be a salesperson. You could lead a sales team. Maybe you run a business or you're a battle-tested entrepreneur. Then we built this podcast for you. Great salespeople are built, not born. We learn so much from the deals we win, but we learn even more from the deals we lose. In each episode, we bring you some of the world's leading salespeople, sales leaders, and experts in sales tech to share their best lessons from both their wins and their losses. Before we start, please check out the screen of your phone or laptop, and if you're watching on YouTube, make sure you've clicked subscribe and press that like button down below. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple, click the plus sign to follow so we can let you know when we publish each new episode. If you like the episode, drop us a comment with any questions about the show. We'd love to get to know our audience. Great businesses always feature world-class salespeople, and the best salespeople are always learning. So let's jump in.
Welcome everybody to another episode of Growth Pulse, the B2B sales podcast. I'm Dan Bartels. I'm joined by Simon Peterson. Mate, welcome back to another episode.
Thanks, mate. Great to be here again. It's been a couple of weeks, I think.
It has been. We did record a couple in in the bank, and we've had a bit of a small personal hiatus, but it's nice to be back on the show again, right? Now we've got a great guest joining us today, Danielle Pearson, who has got one of the most varied and exciting backgrounds I think I've known in my working career. So look, mate, let's get her in. Danielle, welcome to the show.
Hey guys, thanks for having me.
Now, Danielle, I don't even know how to properly introduce you to the show because of really how kind of wild your kind of experience has been. So I don't really almost want to take the wind out of your sails, but look, give everyone a bit of a sort of your historic background of how you got into sales and sort of what you were doing before. Like how do I kind of describe that?
Look, I don't know. I don't think there are words that describe it. Mainly when I talk about my background, so to give a little bit of an idea, I actually started my career in the US military, which that's a whole nother story. I got into it because I'm American, and America is very different than the Aussie market, and school is extremely expensive. So ultimately, I ended up in the Air Force because I wanted to go to a good school and I needed a way to pay for it. But what ended up happening was I became a military officer and I was in intelligence. So I actually spent about 9 years in the US intelligence community. And part of that time was spent with consulting. So I was with Deloitte and Accenture for a period of time. But spent my time with the agency and on covert platforms and how to support those platforms and really learn the ins and outs of analytics and critical thinking. But I was really lucky that I had shadowed a series of partners that knew how to sell. And so I was at the precipice of building a new practice within the Intel community and did that for about 9 years and then came out to Australia via Deloitte. And then decided about a year in that, hang on, I want to get out of consulting. I want to do something different and ultimately brought me to sales. So that's kind of a roundabout explanation.
So Danielle, that's an amazing story. How did you find your way to Australia? What brought you here?
So as I was in the Intel community, and I'm grateful for that time, though it took me a long time to reconcile what that meant to me and probably the skills that I took away from it. But one of the key aspects is I always felt it was picked for me and I was desperately trying to get out of it. And so there were times where I had to go further into it to get out. And I finally, when I was at Deloitte, after doing about 3.5 years of building that practice, finally looked and said, all right, I'm 29 years old. I have to get out of this now. And I really want to go into the commercial realm. And at the time, it was right at the end of the global financial crisis. And I wanted to go into sales. And I would get to the very end of all of these interviews and the sales process, they would say, hey, look, you're great, but you have no prior real sales experience as we look at it, and we're not going to hire you. And so I said, well, all right, what are my other options? And Deloitte had an international exchange program. And I think they still have it to this day, which is fantastic. And originally, I was supposed to go to Barbados. I had picked an opportunity to go to Barbados and build, Deloitte at the time was focusing on the Americas and kind of getting more out of the consulting markets. In the Caribbean, they wanted to consolidate. And so they were looking at building financial services and government, and they wanted a consultant that had an entrepreneurial spirit. And so I said, great, I'm going to Barbados. And they cut me my offer, and I went, it's a 400 to 600% living increase. Are you kidding me? They didn't increase my salary at all. And I thought, well, this isn't going to work. And I looked at one of my mentors and I said, well, what would you do? And he goes, well, I'd go get another offer to create a horse race. And so Australia was never, ever, ever on the radar for me. And I just ended up, at the time, Australia was one of the few places that was taking interviews at the end of the GFC. And so I finally interviewed with Australia and got an offer and then declined it. And I said, nope, not going. And ultimately how I ended up here was there was a partner at Deloitte that literally called me at midnight on a Friday, my time, in Washington, D.C. And I didn't pick up the phone. And he sent me a text and he said, pick up, I'm going to call you back in 5 minutes. And I thought, wow, that's brazen. Like, it's midnight my time. And he called 5 minutes later, like he said, and I reluctantly picked up the phone. And he then proceeded to tell me that I was an absolute idiot. And he goes, you don't go to Barbados to build a career. That's a vacation destination. And I said, I'm pretty sure Australia is also a vacation destination. And he said, you're making a mistake. Basically, I think you should reconsider. And I said, fine, that's okay. Great. Thanks for I'm going to go to bed now, by the way. Thanks for this. And I took about a month to reconsider, went down to Barbados and stepped foot on the ground and went, no, this isn't the right. I haven't been to Australia, but I know this isn't right. And that's ultimately what brought me here.
Wow. So that's what, 15 years ago now?
Oh, don't age me that much. Yeah, look, it's about 12, 13 years. So not too far away.
Yeah, wow.
Not too far away.
Yeah, it's one of those things. It's amazing when I see those who've come and built careers here. Well, all of a sudden they kind of look back and go, "Oh my gosh, that was like that long ago." I can't believe I stepped into tech 15 years ago now myself. It's just like it feels like it was yesterday. So you moved from Intel into consulting into sales. I mean, I'm sure when you started a career in the military, working for big corporates and eventually tech companies probably wasn't on the pathway of what you were considering that you'd end up doing. What do you think were the key skills that you learned during that period of your life that's really built the foundation for what you're doing now? And look, I do want to touch on sort of the exciting business you're building now as well, but what you've done in your career, but also what's leading to for you now.
Yeah, I kind of take into consideration the notion of both nature and nurture, right? So your environment and your career and the choices that you make and the skills that you learn, they absolutely influence you. But the innate you also influences you, right? I don't know if you guys have ever taken the Clifton Strengths. I think they've got the Gallup 5 Strengths. I found that I typically don't like psychometric testing, but I actually found that to be incredibly enlightening, not just how I show up, but how other people show up, right? Because we're all living in our own subjective universes. I happen to be positively and negatively very strategic minded, right? So I can often see the chessboard, all the pieces on the chessboard and where I want to go. And so going back to university before I got into the Air Force is actually a company like Deloitte was always on my radar. I kind of thought, okay, I'll go through the military. I don't know what to expect of this. I said earlier that I signed my contract with the Air Force a day before September 11th. And not that would have changed my decision, but it certainly put things into perspective. And I had no idea what was going to happen, both from an excitement perspective, but also a fear perspective. I'm now in the military. I'm potentially going places that are quite dangerous. So when I was in the Air Force, I always had that Northern Star. I always knew that I was going to get out. I always knew that I wanted to eventually go into the commercial world, but I also left a level of latitude to say, okay, I've got my Northern Star, but I don't know how this is actually going to pan out. And so I remember I gave flexibility and openness with that. And as I was getting out of the Air Force, I ended up just soliciting a lot of people's opinions. Hey, where I want to go to New York and I want to live this dream. And I had this great idea of what I was going to achieve. And then I looked at the reality and I was going to be living on $30,000, $40,000 a year, and not having a luxurious life that I had envisioned. And so I had a lot of people say to me, look, you have a high clearance, I had a TSSCI, and you can go to Washington, D.C., and you can go work for companies like Accenture, Deloitte, and play within the federal sphere or do other things within that area. You can gain skills and then eventually go into the commercial world. And so I'm rambling a little bit, but I guess what I'm trying to say is that I always had that Northern Star. I always had that idea of where do I want to end up? What outcome do I want to drive? And then allow life to kind of jostle me a little bit to take me on that journey.
Yeah, right. So in that journey, like, what do you think that if you had to really define it down to like a singular set of key skills, what do you think that you built the foundations for, and what do you really lean on now?
Yeah. For me, and again, we all have unique skill sets. For me, it's really critical thinking and critical reasoning. And that goes back to seeing the big picture. And definitely when I was in the intelligence community, it definitely capitalized on those skill sets and taught me how to expand upon them. Which is really not taking things at face value, and trying to subvert heuristics as much as possible, knowing that we're wired to do that, right? If you've ever read Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow has a much greater caloric intake than thinking quickly, hence why we tend to think fast rather than slow. But really, it's the big picture thinking, that strategic mindset, and then the critical reasoning associated with that. And that critical reasoning even comes down to choices, right? I had Barbados or Australia. And even though I had someone intervene and be quite brazen with me, there was still a moment of reflection of, well, okay, what do I think I'm going to get out of these? And how do I kind of critically break down the positives and negatives to make that next step?
Danielle, I'm a massive fan of Daniel Kahneman. Incredible books, Thinking Fast, Slow, amazing journey. I think for the audience, do you want to define what you mean by critical thinking?
Yeah, I mean, I think I can't paraphrase the book, it's been a while since I've looked at it, but let's actually go with more simplistic thinking, more of the heuristics, right? It's kind of taking things, you're in an environment and somebody gives you a piece of information. You don't really you take it at face value and go, okay, I'm going to make plans off of that. One of the really good examples I experienced was Salesforce, within the sales sphere. And there's nothing wrong with this. We're going to work our way into the healthcare and life sciences environment, and we're going to do that through medical devices. And why are we going to do that? Because we've got existing use cases in medical devices, they've got deep pockets and money to spend, and we've got a product that actually aligns to that space. Cool, right? And then actually, if you look at the logic, that makes complete sense. But I'd actually put that more in the simplistic thinking, right? You're connecting the immediate dots that are 6 feet in front of you. The more thinking slow or critical thinking, and this is a real world example, is when you actually look at, for instance, the data and you break down that example I just gave of medical devices, and this is where we're going to sell and where we're going to get our beachhead and really expand into. When you look at the data of that and you apply more slow thinking, critical thinking, what you actually find is well, in this country, there's only 500 medical device companies. And actually 50% of those manufacture medical devices and export them. So your product offering doesn't even align to that, 50% of that grouping. Then you've already got a 20% market share. And then in addition to that, 30% of those are multinationals. So that actually changes your entire business model. So actually you're indexing your growth strategy on 30 or 40 companies. And when you take that lens, that logic you just applied in this more simplistic thinking no longer applies.
And I guess so. You're at Salesforce, and it's a high pressure sales environment. You've got a background in strategic thinking. You've got some Deloitte's experience. What did the likes of Salesforce, the whirlwind that is that environment, what did that add to your skill sets?
Oh, so there, I tell you what, and I think across our careers, or at least I know in mine, while every experience adds to your toolkit, good or bad, what you took away from it. I think for me, there are two probably real clear experiences that I look and go, those made a really big impact in my life. One was my experience in the US in Washington, D.C. with Deloitte, and the other was Salesforce. And Salesforce, one, taught me SaaS, which if you think about the environment now, I mean, I entered in at 2013, 2014, to have cloud and understanding how all those things fit together and the expansive definition of CRM, not just leads and opportunities, but how all of that customer data all fits together, how customers buy and how they think about digital transformation, and seeing where things go wrong. That myopic thinking, it always shocks me when you look at large transformation projects, and yet there's often a myopic way of thinking about how to get those systems in. So it taught me sales, it taught me tech. It also taught me, when I had come from being a military officer where I had people that I was the leader, that's what it was. And then at Deloitte, as you kind of move up the ranks, even as a manager, you have consultants and analysts that are reporting to you, for the lack of a better word. But in sales, it was the first time that I only really had to look after myself, but you also have to influence other people. I don't have people directly reporting to me anymore. I'm not Lieutenant or Captain Pearson. I'm just some random salesperson. In fact, a whingy salesperson at that. And so how do you influence people to do what you need them to do in a high pressure situation to close a deal, but they don't actually have to listen to you? So I learned a whole host of skills, and I wouldn't be where I am today if it wasn't for Salesforce. And I genuinely mean that. It was a really pivotal experience for me.
What I was going to say is I've met a lot of salespeople over my career, and one of the things I've often noticed is the best salespeople I've ever worked with, I've often had a background in consulting. You understand, I think that critical thinking piece is a piece of it. But you take a view in your sales cycle where you're solving a genuine problem for a client, and you're piecing it together, and you're not just asking for an order at the end of the quarter. There's a lot more to it. And I think, the best salespeople I've worked with definitely have that little bit of an engineering brain, a problem-solving brain, as you mentioned before, thinking 3 steps ahead of the chess game, etc. And those consulting skills, I think, really make the best salespeople. Do you feel like that certainly helped your entry into Salesforce? And then obviously we'll jump beyond Salesforce in a second. But I think putting those two things together, it's kind of an interesting mix.
Yeah, it is. One thing that it kind of always interests me is the varying aspects of what you need to be across the sales cycle. So for instance, and I'll say this very clearly, I am terrible at prospecting, right? The people that know how to prospect and do it well, hats off to them. It's probably one of the reasons I'm not in sales now, which is just, it's an emotional roller coaster. But to the point that you just made, which is once you've got that opportunity, and you don't get a lot of them, right? I don't know a lot of people that are just swimming in pipeline. That it happens, but most people have to fight for the pipeline. So that means you need to show up and be your best. And where I think all the things that you noted, I agree with, which is that kind of critical thinking, having a point of view, and kind of going back to that CEB, now Gartner, challenger sales methodology of having that point of view. But the other thing I noticed is stakeholder management, not being afraid. And I find there's a lot of fear in sales in the sense of, I've got to close this deal. And if I push back, I may jeopardize my relationship. And there's honesty in that. But I found stakeholder management and being able to push back in a way that the client respects and will listen to you, and having those really important dialogues where they feel like they're getting something out of it. So one example is I'd walked into one client site, and the guy walked in and said, I just learned what the acronym CRM meant yesterday. You sell CRM, show me a demo. And I went, no, I'm not going to do that. And that's a bit of a risky play, right? A lot of people go, okay, I'll show you a demo. But I looked and said, look, let me kind of break down what CRM actually means, and what's your definition, and how does that align to how Salesforce defines it? And then here's the product suite. And that was, I have many instances where those things went pear-shaped, but that was one of those where it actually ended up having a really positive outcome, that they ended up buying, Sales Cloud licenses, but they also bought a series of platform licenses and other capabilities because they knew that their definition versus what the real definition was completely different. So long-winded way of saying all of the things that you outlined, absolutely, but also that stakeholder management piece and not being afraid to push back. I think you learn that in consulting because you're constantly pushing back. You're constantly challenging operating models and ways of thinking.
Yeah, I think that ability and willingness to say no to a client is a key skill you learn, either whether it's through consulting or maturing of your career over time, becomes a really, really important part of what great business people do. It's not just salespeople; business people do it. Does this client fit what I'm trying to sell? Can we actually solve your problem? Do I understand what problem you have to try and solve? And really getting down to some of those really basic components of what are you trying to achieve. Just because they sit in your defined list of target market doesn't mean that they're in the right scale of maturity as to where you can actually be part of what they're going to try and achieve. Is this particular individual or client on the other side just going to be oil and water between your and their personality, and this isn't going to work? Like, all of these things come back into, what does it look like? I had an incident years ago where perfect customer, perfect fit to the TAM, the client on the other side and I just didn't get along. There was nothing we were going to do. And I had to give this deal across to somebody else and say, listen, honestly, here's the papers, go and close it. Please give me some comp at the end of it. But this deal just won't happen while I'm the person handing the paper across. Which we just didn't get along. Which, hey, many will argue there's a long list of people that don't get along with me. That's okay. But understanding those pieces of like, what does it mean to actually get to the outcome of these, and how does it work? So I think this is a delving into critical thinking for you, Danielle. I think it's a superpower, right? So many salespeople don't do it well. And I think we don't critically assess ourselves very well. We're really great at talking out to our customers. Here's my product. It's sort of existential to where I am. But one of the things that I've found that I've had to build skills on is, how do I critically assess myself? And I think a lot of salespeople in the last 12 to 18 months have had to go through that process. How would you recommend that people kind of go through that internal assessment of themselves? You've had some big steps in your career and changes, and I think you've probably learned some key skills there. How would they think about critically assessing themselves?
Yeah, good question. I'll give a roundabout answer, and then I'll give you kind of detailed points. The one thing I'd call out, and I think it's a great question, which is, we are not, as human beings, irrespective of whatever role we play in our careers, we are not taught in school how to critically think. And it's one of the things I'm on a kind of campaign now, which is to say, look, rote memorization and filling in A, B, C, and D and just picking the right answer ends up creating a sect of people. And I think what we have in society, where we're not given the skills to critically think. And then furthermore, we are not rewarded for it when we do. Because if you think about critically thinking, you're going against the grain. You're going, well, no, I don't accept that. I think there's a better way. And even in environments that promote critical thinking and going against the grain, when you actually do it, it doesn't go over well. So let's then apply this to the lens of a salesperson. And now this is just my observation, but one of the observations I made is that there are stereotypes of salespeople. I remember going from consulting, and I'm not the only one. I remember a few people at Salesforce that were ex-consulting, ex-PwC, brilliant people that came in, had the title of account executive, and immediately it's, no, you're just the salesperson, right? You're almost relegated to this version of what they have as a salesperson, and that automatically means that you lack critical thinking skills and maybe you're not very intelligent. I'm not saying that's the case. So I think what I'm saying in one aspect is you're operating in an environment that doesn't think critically and already has a view of what you are. So the first thing is don't buy into that. Don't become that stereotype, because that's the way the world has presented it to you. You don't have to accept that. And then the second bit is and really what you're talking about is being mindful. It's checking in. I love the example that you just provided, and there's a lot of self-awareness to go, hey, I'm in the middle of this deal and I just don't get along with this person. We just aren't getting along. I'm not the right person to push this forward. There's a lot of self-awareness in that. And one thing of my own career and in the critical thinking piece is to check in with yourself. How do I feel about this? What do I want to accomplish? Is there a gap in my skills that I have to, despite my ego may not like that, is there a gap in my skills that I just need to overcome? Am I right on this? The example of, hey, I learned what CRM meant yesterday. That was a great opportunity for me to say, well, let's expand upon that knowledge base. So it's checking in with self to go, how do I feel about this? Where do I stand? Subduing the ego a little bit to know, okay, if my ego's out of shape, that's all right. But how am I driving towards the outcome? And then just being aware that your environment doesn't think critically. So if you are thinking critically, you may have a customer that's not. How do you get them over the line?
Yep. And I think, Danielle, I've experienced periods of my life where I want to think critically, I want to push against the grain, and my boss is absolutely the antithesis of that. Look at the dashboard, tell me what you're going to close tomorrow. Are all your people sat at their desks between 9 and 5? Blah, 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 blah. And I think, I fail in that environment. It's just awful. So I think, working for somebody that isn't open to thinking critically about the problem is a really difficult task. Have you ever had that experience in your life? You're working, underneath someone and it's difficult. How do you cope with that?
I personally have not coped with it very well. I have in a few instances.
Me neither.
And that's where I have in a few instances, some in shared companies, some in not. I've been really lucky in my life for the most part that I have been lucky in the decisions that I've made when I've entered into businesses, that I've commonly been around open-minded people. And I'll be honest with you, there is an element of the question that you just asked, which is, as human beings, what do we want to create and what kind of environments do we want to be in? If you find yourself to being a critical thinker and having a view of how things should be, and you're working for an environment that doesn't allow you to do that, I think one of the first questions you need to ask yourself is this the right place for me? But there is a time period where you have to take people on the journey and at least try. I think with me, I've worked with an organizational psychologist for a long time, and one of my development points is not smacking people in the face with truth. That's one of my things that my org psychologist always says for that. In my past, I've kind of gone, hey, this is broken. We need to fix this now. And that hasn't worked out well. So I think, to answer your question, if you find yourself in that environment and you want to stay there and make it work, then it's more of a surreptitious being patient with your environment and knowing that they're not pushing back on you because it's personal. It's because they're a bit fear-driven. Their feet are in the fire. They need to produce, and they're putting pressure on you because they feel pressure. And there's a bit of empathy that needs to go into that, and a bit of understanding, and an education, a patient education. Now, if that patient education doesn't work after a period of time, then that may not be the right place to be.
Yeah, and I think, Danielle, it's an interesting point you made, because you mentioned empathy there. A question for you, and this may be a bit of looking inwards. Do you think that the background you had, obviously the military training, consulting, etc., does that breed someone that's got high empathy, or did you have to learn that along the way?
That's a really astute, and that's an astute and a deep question. One of the things that I've had to reconcile over the last probably 10 years, I grew up, my dad was in the Air Force. I grew up, the first place I really remember, I lived on a military base that was an F-15 fighter base. So I used to play on B-52s, and there'd be fighter jets going over our head on a consistent basis. To this day, if I hear a fighter jet, I don't even look up because I'm so used to hearing it. And then I moved to Chicago, and it was, we lived in an okay neighborhood, but you definitely had gangs. I learned how to throw a punch and take one at a very young age, right? It was I grew up going, all right, if you're going to get ahead in this world, you've got to fight. And so I took that on, and I went into the military, then the intelligence community, where I worked with alongside special operations and hyper masculine environments. And I became that. I think in one respect, those environments on some level are empathetic because there's a strong level of camaraderie. Everyone has your back. Everyone understands what you're going through. And so on some level, there's empathy, but it's just a hardened environment. It is, kill or be killed kind of way of thinking. And when I kind of transitioned from Washington, D.C. to Sydney, I always make somewhat of a joke, but it was almost like going from Damascus to Disneyland, and you require skills to operate in Disneyland. If you're used to an environment that's extraordinarily hardened, and I was richly rewarded for not being vulnerable and not really being penetrable, then going to an environment where you have all this choice and people are all sorts of different things and some are very touchy-feely, it was overwhelming for me, and I struggled for a long time. So to answer your question, what effectively happened for me was over about a 10-year period of time, and to some extent, I was being declined from jobs I should have had. And one of the reasons I was always given is that you're super intelligent, but people can't connect into you. They don't understand you. And I ended up having to make a decision, and was very lucky that I ended up working with organizational psychologist, that I began to kind of heal as a human being. And as I started to heal, the empathy for others started to emerge. And it sounds a bit cliche, but the whole self-love notion and being kind and compassionate to yourself actually does breed that element to others of, well, if I'm having a difficult time, then actually that person might be having a difficult time too.
Yeah, wow. Look, it's a really key piece, I think, as I've seen salespeople work from being individual contributors into being leaders in an organization. And how do you go from being that internally focused person to actually being externally focused? And I know I went through kind of this transition with Simon in particular when we worked together at Financial Force, but it's irrespective of your background. When you're an individual contributor, you're designed and developed to be singularly focused, almost myopically focused. And then as you start to either build an organization or build a team, now your focus is external to you. And how do you start to bring those people into, or how do you develop those people so they can be successful? And I think those transitions, and whether it is you're working from, I'm running small deals to now I'm running large deals with people who are working in my team, or yes, they're delivering that piece of quota for me or that deal, but I've got multiple stakeholders who are part of this who don't report to me, but they're peers of mine. Like, those skills are so hard to instantly become successful at. And I think we often expect salespeople to had you go from being a great SMB or a mid-market AE. So for different terminologies, you're doing small deals. They're in your industry, whatever it might be, to now want to go and do large deals where everybody in my business is a part of this deal. Why isn't that person instantly successful? Because they were successful last month, last quarter, last year, whatever, at these other style of deals. And it's a completely different set of skills. I suppose in the military, it's someone goes from being an operator to being a team lead. And they put you through a whole bunch of different training sessions to get you to be a successful team lead. They don't stick you out in the field on day one of being a team lead, right? They know they've got to build that. And I think in business, we struggle with ensuring that our people are given that space to learn and fail and be successful. And I think, the work you're doing now around critical thinking, how do you approach that with your customers and clients? How do they build that organizational critical thinking versus that individualistic critical thinking? Is there a different approach, a different way to kind of build those skill sets?
Yeah, look, I'd love to tell you. One, in working with customers, there is an element of working with the right customers. Not everyone's ready. What you just outlined, I find, is kind of the state of the world. It's very myopic, right? You were successful here. I'm going to take you, I'm going to put you over here. You should be successful over here, with no real thinking of what that pathway actually looks like. Well, do I have the skills to do that? I've been singularly focused and only focused on me. I've never had to worry about leading people. Maybe I'm high on the empathy scale. Maybe I'm not. You build that through self-awareness. Have I been trained to do that? So I'm rambling a little bit, but it's kind of from the perspective of not all clients are ready for that message of critical thinking and stopping and taking a step back. And I see it across all aspects of the organization, not just from a sales perspective. In fact, the salespeople and the go-to-market people are the ones I probably feel the worst or most empathy for, because oftentimes you've got a ELT or a leadership team that is thinking myopically of, I've got to drive shareholder value, or I've got venture capital funding and I need to produce a result, or we're not going to have a business, so we're going to do X, Y, and Z, and I'm expecting an immediate return and go deliver that salesperson. And actually, they're not set up to deliver it in market. Either the product doesn't fit, they don't actually have a market, there's no marketing, there's no clear strategy, there's no clear objectives. And so everyone's trying to get something done, and we get lost in trying to drive an outcome. But actually, if you just took a step back for just a second and said, well, actually, what outcome should we be driving, and what's the most logical path forward, and then how does everyone fit into that, and then how are we going to stage this, or a horizon approach, that would actually get you much, much further. So I feel like I somewhat sidestepped your question to kind of say it's more of a systemic problem of how people operate. And that goes back to how we're taught, which is we're not taught to stop and think. We're often taught just to react, to pick what we think is the right answer and move forward. And what you're calling out is that's actually showing up now in our business lives of, you did this great yesterday, now go give me a return and result tomorrow. And in order to break that cycle, you actually have to have an awareness of it and a desire to break it. And so that typically starts with leaders that understand that, have been burnt, and are looking for someone like me that can kind of help change that across the organization.
Yeah, amazing. I think, look, you've now moved back into the world of consulting, advising, thought leadership, etc. Tell me,
Yeah.
I guess, you've moved out of that whole software sales mentality, but you've obviously taken a heck of a lot of those skills and moved them into what you're currently doing now. Tell us a little bit about, day to day for Danielle these days. What are you seeing out there? What are the opportunities you're jumping on? What excites you?
Yeah. So my main goal, a couple of years ago, I had a friend pull me aside. I was in a job I didn't like, and it was during COVID. And I just went, I don't want to make a jump. I'm not happy, but I don't want to make a jump because I'm in the unknown. And my friend pulled me aside and he goes, you strike me as a thought leader. That's what you strike me as. And I don't know if you've ever had the experience where somebody external to you has made an observation that as soon as they say it, you go, oh, it's exactly what I am. I couldn't put it into words, but thank you. And so when you look at the thought leadership world, I break it into two kind of groupings. One is a company of one. Somebody who has a set of skills, right? So I typically get relegated to strategy. I don't always think I sit in strategy, but I get relegated to strategy. And it's going and offering strategic workshops, and let's talk about your mission, vision, purpose, and let's get into the data and your baseline setting, and where's the business headed. Kind of this company of one that I can align to a specific industry or a skill set, but I just want to offer contracts and kind of jump from role to role. And that's fine, no judgments whatsoever. And then you have the other style of thought leader, and that's somebody who's got a platform that isn't necessarily going to align to market need, but has a message. And unfortunately, I sit in the I have a message and trying to align market need. So for me, I'm actually an aspiring author and a public speaker. So I'm working on getting on a TEDx talk about thinking about critical thinking and what I learned from the intelligence community and how that aligns. I'm writing a book right now on why strategy gets a bad rap. So basically, my experience predominantly at Salesforce, but other SaaS businesses that are hyper focused on hyper execution and often miss the whole analyze the data piece and the strategy bit. I have to keep a roof over my head, so I do work with some companies. A lot of them sit within the scale up space and not far removed from technology. So my skills at Salesforce, for instance, in the SaaS environment still very much apply because I operated in those worlds. I understand what they're trying to build, and I understand, what does it mean to be an account executive and actually fill the pipeline? What are the workings between marketing and sales, and how to get this together? What does this mean from the onflow of product and the great market data that salespeople come back with? How do you actually take that customer information and market data and align that to your product to make sure that the product's actually a market fit? And so I actually spend from day to day, if I'm not writing or devising some type of pack to talk about critical thinking and how to get out of that thinking fast, thinking slow, and how to bridge the two worlds, I end up leaning quite heavily on my Salesforce SaaS experience with businesses that are looking to grow, but they're looking for more of that sustainable growth and have an open mind of how they go ahead and achieve that rather than being myopically focused on a singular outcome.
It's interesting you raise that scale up space, which is a piece that so many SaaS companies sell into. And I think for a lot of our listeners are actually in that space or in those types of organizations themselves. So I'd be really intrigued to understand, when you approach that sort of typical customer that you're dealing with at the moment in that scale up space, what's the if there's one feature that kind of stands out the most where, that's their Achilles heel? What is the thing that is, most of your customers that they really have to focus on. And I think the value piece here is not just for those companies, but for those who talk to these companies to understand what happens on their side. Because I can't tell you the number of times I've seen, salespeople at any different organization just not understand their customer base really well. They might understand a bit about sort of the market and some demographics, etc. But understanding the space their customers are in is a really poorly investigated space.
Yeah, there's a couple things that I often see. One, why do you exist? What pain point are you solving? And there was some really good data that came out of, I think it was Blackbird, on venture capital portfolios. So if you're in a scale up, this kind of notion of I've got venture funding, so I'm good. I must have a good idea because I've had a venture capitalist invest in me. But actually, you probably do have a good idea. That's how you solidified funding. Most people aren't able to solidify funding. But actually, if you look at, and I released an infographic on this not long ago, if you look at a portfolio of about 100 companies that a VC might invest in, they automatically anticipate that about 64% of those are going to go belly up, that they're going to completely lose their money. 32 of those, or 32%, they'll break even on, and about 4 they'll actually make their profit on. So even if you're in a scale up, and the astute CEOs know this and leadership teams know this, the odds that you're not going to make it are actually still fairly high, even if you're sitting at a Series C, Series D kind of environment. So what I often find is that, one, do you know what you're solving in market? And will someone pay for it? And I think I was working with a company that's digitizing the door tag on a hotel. And actually, what I didn't realize, and it's something like 70% of businesses still have some type of analog, manual, paper-based process, which is just crazy. It's 2023. It's insane to think that. But in this particular hospitality example, the back end of a maid or a Betty actually getting scheduled to go clean a room. And if you think about the situation of a hotel, if you're not checking out that day, then there's really no understanding of when you're going to leave your room. And so if you've ever been stalked by a maid, it's because he or she is desperately trying to get in to clean that room because she needs to check that off her paper-based blotter. And you would think, oh, that's a great technology piece. They should be killing it because it's all manual and there's a lot of efficiencies lost. But one of the realities is, and they're still out there that, really making inroads. But the reality is if you look at the business model of hospitality and who's actually going to pay for that and where the money comes from a developer who's actually devising a hotel through to, who's actually running that hotel and the margins that they're sitting at, just because you're solving a very logical pain point doesn't actually mean there's going to be money associated with it. So going back is, what pain are you solving? Is someone going to pay for it? And then of the challenges, and this is one that I see also regularly, of the challenges that you're seeking to solve, are they the actual challenges you need to solve? So one example, and this wasn't a client, but this was an organization I worked with, the CEO felt that he had a big problem with sales. Marketing was meeting all of their KPIs, sales was not meeting their KPIs, and it must be a sales problem. And then you actually look at the organization and they had a massive sales problem, but that's largely because when sales would go out and talk about product and they'd say, oh, the product's going to be ready in 6 months. And then actually the product was ready in 18 months. Well, the client already walked off by then. And so sales couldn't influence product to get the product cycles to where it needed to be. And so they always were kind of lying, even though they had no intention of lying. And then furthermore, when you actually looked at the marketing KPIs, they did nothing to help the salesperson fill the funnel. So they were picked as KPIs, and the marketer, who was very brilliant and very motivated, hit them out of the park, but they didn't actually do anything to help sales. So it was like, well, yes, you do have a sales problem, but not for the reason that you think you have a sales problem. It's not about firing the VP or getting rid of that account executive. It's about moving the challenges out of their way.
So, Danielle, we've had a great talk about critical thinking. We're sort of coming towards the end of the hour. I guess one of the things that we often like to ask our guests towards the end of the show, you've been in a whole bunch of really interesting positions, learned a lot over that period of time. Our audience is mostly in sales. Can you summarize any, 1 or 2 key things you've learned across the way that you would like to give advice to some of the people listening? Because I think you've got a wealth of experience, really interesting, diverse background. I'd love to hear sort of one or two gold nuggets that you'd like to share with the audience.
Probably two, and they're a little bit generic, but they're meaningful. One, and I think it's been a consistent theme throughout this, actually, both of them have, is don't be afraid to take a step back and think about things, pause. Someone gave me that advice a long time ago, which is basically just take a step back and breathe. Whatever you think is absolutely critical to jump into right at this moment in time, reflect on it. And again, the conversation we had previously, which is we're so myopically driven towards an outcome and it's just go get it done. It's take a step back. Does this make sense? Is this going to achieve what I'm seeking to achieve? Is there a better way? That doesn't take hours. You don't have to do a strategic offsite to do that. It can be 5 minutes of just reflect, does this make sense? So that's number one. And the second piece, and this has been really intrinsic to my journey, particularly over the last 10 years, is that self-reflection.
Danielle, the big lesson there, I'm going to summarize that. That's just take a step back and breathe. And it's interesting, in my career, I've seen leaders tell me I need to fire salespeople, I need to get rid of people, and they're panicking, and it's all, frightfully frenetic. And I think it doesn't need to be. And I love that advice. I think it's, I think for everybody that's listening, when you're stressed out, you're running around. I remember my first quarter end, it was awful. And one of the things that I've learned along the way is just breathe. And sales has a lot of ups and downs. Remember, there are going to be some downs for every time you have an up, and that's just normal. And just take a step back and breathe. And I think that's wonderful, wonderful advice. Danielle, thank you so much for appearing on the podcast today. It was awesome to have you, and I know it's been incredible to reconnect after all this time. I wish you absolutely the very best of luck with what you're up to. It sounds incredibly exciting, critical thinking, some great thought leadership, and a wonderful career you've had so far. Can't wait to see what you do next. Thank you so much, Danielle.
Thanks. Thank you, Simon.